The courthouse buzzed with the low murmur of people waiting for their cases to be called. Tasha Williams stepped into the room, her heels clicking softly against the cool tiled floor. She looked around at the sea of faces seated in the gallery. Most of them were familiar with the routine, the long waits, the disinterested judges. The feeling that no one really cared what happened to them today was no different, except for one thing. Tasha wasn't just anyone. She wasn't here because of a minor infraction or a simple mistake. She was here because of a parking ticket, a small thing that seemed so trivial in comparison to the cases she usually handled. She had spent years fighting for justice in federal courtrooms, and yet now she was standing before a judge in a small-town courthouse facing a man whose reputation preceded him, Judge Robert Ellison. Known for his quick and often harsh rulings on cases like this, he was a man of strict principles. At least that's what people said. But what did he really know about fairness, about what it meant to fight for what was right? Tasha couldn't help but wonder if he had ever truly seen people like her, people who had to fight every day, not just against the law, but against the assumptions people made about them simply because of the way they looked. She glanced at the judge as he took his seat behind the bench, his gaze never meeting hers, his attention already on the next case in line. He was a man of routine, a man of certainty. She could already feel the weight of his judgment on her shoulders before he had even spoken her name, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. As the courtroom quieted and the clerk called her name, Tasha stood up and made her way to the front. Her steps were steady. She felt the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't flinch. She had been in bigger rooms with more dangerous stakes. She could handle this, but the moment she stood in front of the judge, she knew this wouldn't be a simple hearing. The judge looked at her with an air of condescension, his eyes scanning her quickly before he looked down at the paperwork in front of him. Tasha Williams. The judge muttered the name as if it were just another case to dispose of. He asked her why she was disputing the ticket. Without even waiting for her to explain, he continued to read the details aloud in a dry, monotone voice. Tasha could tell that he had already made up his mind. His tone suggested he thought this was just another minor infraction, a trivial case that didn't deserve much attention. She felt a flicker of frustration deep within her. She had been in courtrooms where people's lives were at stake, and yet here she was fighting over something so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But to her it was not insignificant. It was a matter of principle. If the law was going to be fair, it had to be fair to everyone, not just the ones the system decided were deserving of it. She took a breath and then spoke calmly, as if she were speaking to a room full of seasoned attorneys, not a man who had already decided her fate before hearing her side. "I believe this ticket was issued unfairly," she said, her voice steady but firm. "There are extenuating circumstances that should be considered. I parked there because I was forced to make an emergency stop and was unaware of the restriction at the time." The judge barely looked up from his papers, dismissing her explanation with a wave of his hand. He was clearly uninterested in what she had to say. This was routine for him. He had seen it all before in his mind. People who challenged tickets were just trying to get out of paying, and nothing more. But Tasha wasn't going to let him get away with it, not without a fight. Tasha didn't back down. She straightened her shoulders, her voice unwavering as she continued. "I understand your position, Your Honor, but I'm asking for fairness. The situation was beyond my control, and there's evidence to support my claim. I wasn't trying to avoid responsibility. I'm asking you to reconsider the fine based on the facts." Her words, calm yet insistent, filled the space between them. She knew the law, and she knew this wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about principle. Judge Ellison's eyebrows furrowed, but he still wasn't having it. He had dealt with dozens of people like her over the years. Defendants who came into court with excuses, hoping to slip by without paying the price. Tasha's demeanor, her precise language, and her refusal to back down irritated him more than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, his voice gruff. "Ms. Williams, I'm sure you have many important things to do, but this is a simple matter. You either pay the fine, or you don't. I don't need a lengthy explanation." Tasha's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to let him dismiss her so easily. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about how often people in power dismissed those who didn't look like them. didn't come from the same background. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her, the way he was already seeing her as another nuisance in his day. She wasn't going to be another case number. She was someone who mattered, who deserved respect. "I'm not asking for leniency, Your Honor," she said, her tone taking on a sharper edge. "I'm asking for justice. I'm asking you to look at the facts. You have the power to decide what's right here. And I believe that if you review this matter properly, you'll see that the ticket was issued in error. There are witnesses who can attest to the circumstances. I wasn't parked there because I didn't care. I had to stop, and I did so with the best intentions. The ticket was a mistake, and I'm here to ask for it to be corrected." Judge Ellison was growing visibly frustrated, his fingers tapping on the bench as he looked down at the ticket in front of him. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not in his own courtroom. He had the final say. His rulings were never questioned, and here was a woman who didn't look like most of the people he usually dealt with, telling him he was wrong. "You're wasting my time, Ms. Williams," he snapped, his voice tight. "This is a straightforward case, and I've already made my decision. You can either pay the fine, or I'll escalate it." His eyes flicked up at her, daring her to say something more. "I don't have time for these games." Tasha felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She could feel the room's atmosphere shift, the quiet whispers from the gallery as they sensed the growing tension. This wasn't just about a ticket anymore. It was a battle for respect, a challenge to the idea that people like her could be dismissed so easily. She paused for a moment, her gaze steady on the judge's face. "Your Honor, I'm not here to play games. But if you're so certain you're right, I'm asking you to give me the opportunity to present my case fully. Let's get the facts straight. Let's have this reviewed. It's your call, but I'm confident that you'll see things differently once the full picture is presented." Judge Ellison hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. For the first time in the proceedings, he wasn't sure what to do. He had assumed this would be another routine case, another easy decision. But Tasha's calm persistence was making him question himself. The judge's eyes narrowed as he stared at Tasha, the hint of unease creeping into his usually implacable demeanor. He'd handled hundreds, if not thousands, of cases like this. Defendants coming in with half-baked excuses, hoping to get away with a fine or a dismissal. But there was something about her, something different, something that made him pause. He glanced down at the paperwork again, hoping to find something that would justify his stance, but he came up empty. Tasha wasn't just another person trying to squirm out of a ticket. She wasn't begging for leniency or pleading with him to show mercy. She was challenging him, with precision and confidence, in a way that unsettled him. It was as if she weren't just speaking to him as a judge, but as an equal, someone who wasn't going to be dismissed with a few lines of dismissal. "Federal prosecutor." The words left the judge's mouth in a mutter, as though he were trying to process them. He repeated them, louder this time, looking at her with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Did you just say you're a federal prosecutor?" His voice softened, but there was no hiding the surprise in his tone. He hadn't expected that. Tasha nodded slowly, her expression calm but firm. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm a federal prosecutor. I handle complex legal cases involving civil rights violations, fraud, and more. And I assure you, this ticket, this matter, isn't as straightforward as you're treating it." The room grew quiet. The sound of the judge's gavel, which usually punctuated proceedings, felt distant now. Even the murmurs in the gallery seemed to fade. Tasha's revelation hung in the air like a weight, drawing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. The judge blinked, his mind racing as the implications of her statement began to settle in. This wasn't just a woman challenging a parking ticket. This was a woman who understood the law, perhaps better than he did. His eyes flicked to the clerk at the side of the room, who immediately began flipping through a file, checking Tasha's credentials. The tension in the room was palpable now, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as those watching began to realize what had just been revealed. The judge, who had so casually dismissed Tasha only moments before, suddenly found himself on unsteady ground. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a man facing someone who had spent years in courtrooms where the stakes were far higher than this. Tasha stood there, unwavering, but she could feel the change in the room. The gallery, which had been filled with quiet murmurs before, was now dead silent, watching the interaction unfold with curiosity. Her revelation wasn't about boasting. It was about making sure the judge knew exactly who he was dealing with. He needed to understand that Tasha Williams wasn't just any defendant. She was someone who fought for justice, someone who knew how the system worked inside and out, and someone who wasn't about to let anyone, especially a judge, get away with careless assumptions. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I don't want this to turn into a spectacle. I'm simply asking for a fair review. You've already decided to issue the fine without fully hearing my case. I'm asking you to reconsider. And I trust that, as a judge, you will take into account the law. What is right, not just what is easiest." The judge's eyes flicked back to the paperwork in front of him. And this time, he lingered. There was no doubt in his mind that Tasha's position was serious. His grip on the gavel tightened slightly, his knuckles turning white. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a feeling that he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. This wasn't just a parking ticket anymore. It was a test of his authority, his biases, and his willingness to uphold true justice. "Ms. Williams," he said after a long, tense pause, his voice lower now, more measured, "I will review the matter, but I'm not promising any changes." Tasha didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for promises, Your Honor. I'm asking for fairness." The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of his face. The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable now. He had never liked being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. He had always prided himself on his decisiveness, his ability to handle cases with little fuss. But Tasha Williams had rattled him in a way no one else ever had. She wasn't just questioning his ruling. She was questioning the very nature of his authority. And that wasn't something he took lightly. For a moment, Judge Ellison's mind raced. He had always believed that people like Tasha, educated, articulate, ambitious, had no real place in his world. He wasn't a racist, at least not consciously. He didn't consider himself prejudiced. But as he glanced at Tasha, standing there calmly, so composed, it was hard not to wonder if his own biases had been at play. He had assumed she was just another woman trying to avoid responsibility. He had dismissed her based on nothing more than a superficial judgment. And now, with her revelation that she was a federal prosecutor, he felt the sting of his own ignorance. "Ms. Williams, I understand that you may be used to a different sort of courtroom," Judge Ellison said slowly, his tone still tinged with defensiveness. "But this is not a criminal trial. It's a simple matter of a parking ticket. I don't need a lecture on fairness or the law." Tasha's eyes didn't leave his as he spoke. She wasn't surprised by his words. She had expected him to resist. She had expected him to fight back, to protect his pride. But she wasn't here for him to admit he was wrong. She was here for him to do his job, to take a step back and recognize that sometimes the law wasn't as simple as it seemed. "I'm not lecturing you, Your Honor," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for a fair hearing, not special treatment. I understand this is a minor case in your eyes, but I have seen too many people in my career who've been dismissed in the same way. The difference is, I'm not going to let you get away with it." The judge's face tightened. He had been caught off guard, something that rarely happened to him. For the first time in his career, he felt his authority questioned by someone who, on paper, was far beneath him in the hierarchy of the legal system. She wasn't just another defendant. She was someone who could hold her own against him, against anyone, and he couldn't ignore it. He cleared his throat, the familiar sound of the gavel never seeming so far away. "You are overstepping your bounds, Ms. Williams. I will not tolerate defiance in my courtroom." But even as he said the words, there was a flicker of doubt in his mind. He had seen too many cases where the system had failed, where people had been dismissed not for lack of merit, but because they didn't fit the right mold. People like Tasha, who came from a different background, who spoke with conviction and confidence, were often seen as troublemakers. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the growing sense that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Tasha noticed the subtle shift in his posture. It wasn't much, just a brief pause, a subtle hesitation, but it told her everything she needed to know. She had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was up to her to let it grow. The judge's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "I will review your request. I'm not promising any changes, but I'll take your argument into consideration." He looked down at the case file again, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface of the bench. He couldn't look her in the eye now, not in the same way he had before. It was as though her revelation had shifted the power balance between them. Tasha didn't press further. She didn't need to. She knew she had made her point. She simply nodded, her expression composed. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her words clipped but professional. The judge didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for the clerk to make a note in the record, signaling the end of the hearing. But as Tasha turned to leave, she could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her. It was no longer just about a parking ticket. It was about something much bigger, and she had just won the first battle in a long and difficult fight. As she made her way toward the door, she couldn't help but glance back at the judge one last time. His face was unreadable now, but she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The ripple effects of this moment would reverberate far beyond this courtroom, and Tasha, ever determined, would be there to make sure they did. As Tasha stepped out of the courtroom, the murmur of the gallery seemed to follow her like a quiet hum. She could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Something had shifted. The usual energy of the courthouse, the low drone of voices, the shuffle of papers, felt distant now. People were talking about her, not just because she was a woman challenging a parking ticket, but because of what she represented. Outside the courtroom, Tasha pulled her coat a little tighter around her shoulders. She had expected to leave the courthouse just as quietly as she had entered, but something in the air had changed. Her presence had caused ripples, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure whether the ripples would lead to anything good or bad. She had made her point, but the consequences of what she'd done were still uncertain. The way Judge Ellison had reacted, it wasn't just irritation anymore. It was doubt. He was questioning himself, and that, in itself, was a victory. But Tasha wasn't the type to gloat. Her fight wasn't over. Across the hallway, she caught the glance of a young clerk who had been sitting in the gallery. The clerk smiled at her, a silent nod of approval. Tasha nodded back, then made her way toward the exit. She needed to get back to her office, to the real work she had to do. But even as she walked through the marble corridors of the courthouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions today had set something in motion that would be impossible to stop. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Judge Ellison sat in his chair, staring at the same stack of papers he had been holding when Tasha walked in. But now, the words on the page seemed distant, meaningless. He didn't know what to do with the unsettling feeling in his gut. It was rare for him to feel anything but in control when he was in his courtroom. But Tasha had taken that control from him, bit by bit. She had confronted him with his own biases and forced him to recognize something he had always overlooked. Her words, calm, precise, unwavering, had left an impression on him. He didn't even know why he'd asked for her credentials. It wasn't as if her being a federal prosecutor was supposed to change anything. But it did. Somehow, it did. The fact that she was someone who had spent years fighting cases in federal court made her challenges to his authority feel like a personal challenge. She had taken the most trivial matter, a simple parking ticket, and turned it into a conversation about fairness, the law, and bias. He could hear her words echoing in his mind. "I'm asking for fairness, not special treatment." He shifted in his seat, staring at the files, but they felt like they were no longer connected to the reality of what had just transpired. The paperwork in front of him seemed so small, so insignificant compared to what Tasha had uncovered in him, his own shortcomings as a judge. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and the clerk entered with a quiet urgency. "Judge Ellison, the report from the parking department has just come in. It seems there were errors in the ticketing system that day. It was issued under a restricted code that wasn't properly updated." Ellison's hand froze over the papers. He had been expecting this, even if he hadn't wanted to admit it. The fine was wrong. The ticket had been issued unfairly. The system had failed, and now it was going to have to be corrected. His mind swirled with the implications. What did this mean for the case? What did it mean for him? For a moment, he felt the weight of everything that had happened today settle on him. Tasha had exposed him, made him realize that perhaps he wasn't as unbiased as he had always believed. He had treated her like just another defendant, assuming she was just another person trying to skirt the law. But she wasn't. She was someone who had come prepared to fight, who had demanded more than just a fair trial. She had demanded to be seen, to be heard. The clerk continued speaking, but Judge Ellison wasn't really listening. His thoughts were racing. The ripple Tasha had caused was only beginning to reach its full force, and now he was at the center of it. The next few days passed in a blur for Tasha. She was back in her office, the usual grind of her work consuming most of her attention, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted. The courthouse, the judge, the ticket, it all seemed so trivial in comparison to the ripples she had set in motion. She knew she had done the right thing by standing her ground, but she also knew that pushing back against a figure of authority in a small town wasn't without consequences. Her phone buzzed on her desk, dragging her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. She picked up. Tasha Williams. "Ms. Williams, this is the office of Judge Robert Ellison. The judge would like to schedule a follow-up meeting with you regarding the case from last week." Tasha's pulse quickened. A follow-up meeting? She hadn't expected that. She had assumed the matter was closed. She had won her point in court after all. The case should have been dismissed, the ticket annulled. But now, she could sense that there was something else at play. She took a deep breath before responding. "Of course, I'll make myself available. When would be convenient for the judge?" The clerk's voice remained neutral. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The judge has asked that you come to his chambers. He wants to discuss the issue personally." Tasha's brow furrowed. She couldn't quite decipher the tone behind the request, but one thing was clear. This was no longer about a parking ticket. This was something else entirely. The next morning, Tasha arrived at the courthouse early. The halls were quieter than usual, and as she made her way to Judge Ellison's chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a simple meeting. She had already spoken her piece in court. She had made her position clear. But now, there was the sense that a deeper conversation was about to unfold, one that might take them both into unfamiliar territory. The clerk led her into the judge's chambers, a wood-paneled room lined with legal books and a large desk where Judge Ellison sat, his expression unreadable. He rose as she entered, motioning for her to take a seat. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Williams. Please, have a seat." Tasha sat down, studying him closely. His demeanor was different today. Less rigid, less authoritative. There was something more reflective in his posture, something she hadn't seen before. She couldn't decide whether this was a sign of respect or a signal that he was trying to reassert control. Either way, she was prepared for what came next. Judge Ellison didn't waste any time. "I've reviewed the case," he began, his voice quieter than she remembered, almost apologetic. "The ticket was issued incorrectly, and I believe it should be dismissed. You were right about the circumstances. There was an error in the system that led to your ticket being issued under a restricted code. That wasn't your fault, and I've taken steps to have it removed from your record." Tasha nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She had known the ticket was a mistake. What she didn't expect was for him to admit it so readily. She had expected resistance, a justification for why the system was the way it was. But here he was, acknowledging the error, acknowledging that he had been wrong. "I appreciate that," Tasha said, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about one ticket. This is about a broader issue. The way this system works, the assumptions that get made about people like me before the facts are even considered. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness, for the same standards to be applied to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Judge Ellison's eyes flicked to the papers on his desk, his fingers tapping nervously against the wood. He looked unsettled. "I understand that," he said after a long pause. "I've had a lot of time to think about your argument, Ms. Williams. You made me see things I hadn't considered before. I'm not proud of that. I've prided myself on being impartial, but I've realized that's not enough. Impartiality isn't enough when there's bias beneath the surface." Tasha sat back in her chair, surprised by his admission. She had expected him to defend himself, to make excuses for his actions, but here he was, acknowledging something she had long known to be true, that the system was broken, that bias and assumptions colored even the most seemingly neutral decisions. "You're right," Judge Ellison continued, his voice heavier now. "I've been in this job a long time, and I've seen things differently than I should have. I've been too quick to make judgments, too quick to dismiss people who didn't fit the mold I expected them to fit. I made that mistake with you." Tasha's heart raced. This wasn't just an apology. This was something more. For the first time in their interaction, she saw him for who he truly was, an old man, set in his ways, but capable of growth, capable of change. "So, what happens now?" she asked, her voice steady. Judge Ellison looked her directly in the eye. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. I've spoken to my colleagues, and I'm pushing for a review of how we handle minor infractions, to ensure that bias doesn't influence our rulings. I'm not sure what the outcome will be, but it's time for a change." Tasha felt a flicker of hope. The conversation wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like something real was happening, like the system was finally beginning to shift. The ripples she had created were starting to turn into waves. And this time, she wasn't backing down. Certainly, here's the continuation of Part 7, further exploring the aftermath of the meeting and the consequences of Tasha's actions. Tasha left Judge Ellison's chambers with a quiet sense of triumph, but it was tempered by a deep, almost reluctant understanding. The conversation had gone better than she expected, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the work was far from over. It was one thing for Ellison to admit his mistake. It was another for real change to happen. She had seen enough of the system to know that words alone weren't enough. It would take more than a single conversation to dismantle the biases embedded in the court's fabric. But for the first time, there was a crack in the foundation. And for that, she was determined to fight. As she walked through the courthouse halls, the usual hum of activity felt different. The whispers had quieted when she entered Judge Ellison's office, but now the air seemed thick with anticipation, as if everyone knew something was shifting. She didn't want to believe she was the catalyst for that shift, but part of her knew she had been. It wasn't just about the ticket. It wasn't just about her fight for fairness. It was about what her actions represented. A challenge to the status quo, a refusal to accept the things that had been brushed under the rug for too long. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out to find a message from her assistant, Marcus. "Marcus, the press is starting to catch wind of your case. There's a reporter outside asking for comment. You might want to prepare." Tasha frowned. She hadn't expected her small legal battle to make headlines, but it made sense. The moment she'd stood up to Judge Ellison, something about that exchange had caught people's attention. The idea of a black woman challenging a judge in such a direct way was unusual, even in a city like this, where diversity was often only skin deep. Tasha didn't want to be caught off guard. She needed to get ahead of the story, before the narrative spun out of her control. She typed a quick response to Marcus. Tasha, tell them I'll give a statement in an hour. Set up a meeting in my office. I need to be prepared. Tasha took a deep breath as she walked down the corridor. The reporter would want to know everything about the case, about her background, about her motivations. It wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about her stance on justice, on fairness, on holding those in power accountable. It was about the system itself, about how people like her, people who fought for justice every day, were still marginalized and dismissed. Back in her office, Tasha sat down at her desk, organizing her thoughts. She couldn't afford to sound defensive or angry in front of the press. They would be looking for a soundbite, something that would fit their narrative. They wanted a story, a headline, a spectacle. But Tasha didn't care for spectacle. She cared about justice. She reviewed the documents from her conversation with Judge Ellison. He had promised to push for a review of how minor infractions were handled, to ensure that bias didn't influence rulings. That was a significant step, but she knew that these promises had to be followed through, had to be seen to fruition. There were still so many layers of the system that needed to be addressed, so many people who were overlooked simply because they didn't have the means or the platform to challenge it. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her colleague, Chris, a fellow prosecutor who had been following the case. Chris, I heard about your meeting with the judge. Sounds like a breakthrough. Don't let them make this about you. Make it about the change that's needed. Chris's words resonated deeply. This wasn't about her personal victory. It was about something much larger. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Tasha looked up to see Marcus entering, followed by a reporter and a cameraman. The reporter, a young woman in her mid-30s with short dark hair, introduced herself quickly. Ms. Williams, the reporter said, her voice professional but probing, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. We've been following the case with Judge Ellison closely. Can you tell us what this experience has been like for you? Tasha leaned forward, her hand steady on the desk. This was the moment she had been waiting for, not just to speak about her case, but to speak for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter, for everyone who had been dismissed by the system. It's been frustrating, Tasha began, her voice calm but resolute. But it's also been enlightening. I've seen firsthand how biases can influence decisions, even in small matters. It's not just about the ticket. It's about the way the system works, the way people are treated based on assumptions. I stood up to that. And I'll continue to stand up to it, because it's time for a change. Not just in this courthouse, but in every courthouse. The reporter nodded, jotting down notes. And do you think Judge Ellison's commitment to a review of the system is enough? Tasha's gaze hardened. I think it's a start. But words are easy. What matters is action. Judge Ellison has taken a step in the right direction, but the real question is whether that momentum will continue, whether it will reach every corner of this system. Because if it doesn't, then we're just going through the motions. As the reporter asked her more questions, Tasha answered with the same level-headed precision she always carried in the courtroom. But in her mind, the conversation was just the beginning. It wasn't just about changing one case or one judge's mind. It was about changing the entire system. And that was a fight she was ready for. The media frenzy surrounding Tasha's case escalated quickly, with news outlets, social media platforms, and even local community leaders discussing the events that had unfolded in Judge Ellison's courtroom. What had started as a simple challenge to a parking ticket had become a symbol of the larger issues within the legal system: bias, fairness, and accountability. Tasha's stance had struck a chord with many, especially those who had long felt overlooked or discriminated against by a system that seemed to operate on assumptions more than evidence. For the first time in a long time, Tasha felt a sense of solidarity from the community. Letters of support flooded her inbox, and people, strangers, colleagues, even old friends, stopped her on the street to thank her for speaking out. Some said she had given them hope that their own voices could be heard. Others thanked her for challenging an authority that had gone unquestioned for too long. It was humbling, but it also reminded her of the long road ahead. A single victory, no matter how public, wasn't enough to dismantle years of systemic injustice. The chain she had started could easily be undone if she wasn't vigilant. In the weeks that followed, Judge Ellison made good on his word. The court system began the slow, arduous process of reviewing its procedures. The state commission tasked with overseeing the judiciary began an internal audit of minor infraction rulings, with an emphasis on reducing bias in ticketing systems. Ellison personally advocated for further education on cultural competency, anti-bias training, and clearer guidelines for issuing tickets. But Tasha knew that the real challenge lay in whether these changes would be implemented at all levels, or whether they would be swept aside as just another round of bureaucracy. One afternoon, Tasha was sitting in her office when she received a call from Marcus. "You need to come down here. There's something you should see." Tasha's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "It's the next step, Tasha. You've got an invitation." "An invitation?" she repeated, confused. "It's from the state's Judicial Review Board," Marcus clarified. "They want to meet with you. They're asking for your input on the upcoming reforms. They want to hear from you, personally." Tasha felt a surge of emotion, surprise, disbelief, and a little apprehension. She had known the changes would take time, but this was a moment of recognition, a sign that her actions had made an impact. Still, she was cautious. She had seen enough to know that sometimes, when those in power offer a seat at the table, it isn't always because they want to listen. "That's unexpected," she said, her voice quiet. "But I'll be there." When Tasha arrived at the review board's meeting the following week, she was greeted with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The room was filled with high-ranking judges, lawyers, and legislators, people who had spent years in the system, often behind closed doors. She was the only one in the room who wasn't part of the establishment, and she could feel their eyes on her. They weren't sure what to make of her, this young prosecutor who had taken on a judge so publicly, so decisively. But Tasha stood tall, confident in the knowledge that she had a platform. And she wasn't going to waste it. The first few minutes were awkward, as the board members went through their prepared statements and talked about the importance of integrity and accountability. But when they turned to Tasha, the room fell silent. She cleared her throat and began speaking, her words measured but unwavering. "I appreciate the opportunity to be here today," she began. "But let's be clear. What we're discussing isn't just about minor infractions or parking tickets. This is about the very structure of our judicial system. We cannot allow ourselves to be blinded by tradition or complacency. The truth is that biases, both implicit and explicit, influence nearly every decision we make, from who gets charged to who gets a break. These biases are systemic, and they are far too often overlooked. Reforming ticketing procedures is a start, but it's not nearly enough." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We need full accountability. Every step of this process, from how tickets are issued to how cases are handled, must be subject to scrutiny. The law is supposed to be fair, but it's only fair if everyone is treated equally, if everyone's rights are respected, if everyone's case is considered on its own merits. We can't keep sweeping these issues under the rug." There was a long silence. Tasha could see the weight of her words landing on some of the members of the board, and she saw others shift uncomfortably in their seats, but no one interrupted her. When she finished, there was a pause before one of the senior judges spoke up, his voice measured but respectful. "Ms. Williams, I think we all understand the gravity of what you're saying, and we're listening. You've given us a lot to think about." Over the next few months, Tasha continued to be involved in the reform efforts. It wasn't easy. There were always forces at play that wanted to maintain the status quo, that saw change as a threat to their power. But Tasha wasn't going to back down. She was no longer just a prosecutor in a courtroom. She had become a voice for justice, for fairness, and for change. And as she sat in those meetings, listening, advocating, pushing, she knew that her battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone.